You can almost hear it before you see it. The low hum of wind over a landscape that once echoed with artillery fire. The fields of northern France, now quiet and green, were once carved open by trenches that stretched for hundreds of miles. The Western Front of the First World War was not a battlefield in the traditional sense. It was a long, narrow wound in the earth filled with men, mud, and misery. When the war began in August 1914, few imagined it would become a years-long struggle of attrition. The armies of Europe still carried the romantic visions of 19th century warfare, glorious cavalry charges, quick maneuvers, and decisive victories. But by the end of the first year, those illusions had been buried beneath the churned soil of Flanders and the Somme. What replaced them was a static line of defense and endurance. Soldiers dug in, fortified their positions, and waited for orders, for shells, for something to change. The trenches themselves began as shallow ditches hastily dug to protect from enemy fire. Over time, they grew deeper and more elaborate, forming a network of communication lines, support trenches, and frontline positions. By 1916, a typical trench system might stretch 3 or 4 miles deep, with zigzagging paths designed to prevent a single shell or enemy assault from sweeping through. Sandbags reinforced the parapets. Wooden planks, known as duckboards, lined the floors to keep soldiers above the perpetual pools of water. Drainage was always poor. Rain turned the clay soil into glue, and the trenches filled with stagnant puddles that froze in winter and festered in summer. The smell was the first thing new recruits noticed. A mixture of unwashed bodies, decaying food, rotting sandbags, human waste, and something far worse, death. Dead men often lay just beyond the parapets, unreachable under constant sniper fire. Sometimes they lay in no man's land, only a few yards away, where they would slowly decompose in view of the living. The soldiers grew accustomed to the stench. It clung to their uniforms and seeped into their skin. There were, of course, the rats. They thrived in the trenches. The men called them trench rats, and they were not exaggerating their size. Some were said to grow as large as cats, feasting on corpses and scraps of food. Soldiers tried to kill them, shooting, clubbing, trapping, but they multiplied faster than they could be eliminated. Some soldiers took a grim sort of humor in it, naming the biggest rats or staging competitions to see who could kill the most. Others simply learned to ignore them, just as they ignored the lice that crawled beneath their collars and the frogs that swam in their water-filled dugouts. Life in the trenches followed a strange rhythm. Days passed in routine, cleaning rifles, repairing sandbags, filling sandbags again, and standing watch. At night, when darkness offered some cover, soldiers might be ordered to repair barbed wire or carry supplies to the front. Sleep was rare, and when it came, it was light and uneasy. Shellfire could begin at any hour, and orders to attack or defend could come without warning. One British soldier, Private Frederick Tubb, described the monotony and exhaustion in a letter home. "You cannot imagine what it is like here. The rats crawl over us at night, and the water seeps through everything. I think sometimes we have forgotten what dry feels like. When the guns are quiet, we sleep, but even in our dreams we can hear them." The guns, of course, were seldom quiet for long. Artillery was the dominant weapon of the war. A single barrage could last for hours, sometimes days, before an attack. The sound was deafening, rolling thunder that shook the earth. Soldiers described the sensation of shells passing overhead as a low scream followed by a crushing silence, and then a roar as they struck. Many men suffered not from physical wounds, but from the psychological strain of constant bombardment. They called it shell shock, though today it would be recognized as a form of post-traumatic stress. Between the trenches lay no man's land, a desolate strip of mud, craters, barbed wire, and shattered trees. It could be as narrow as 30 yards or as wide as several hundred. Crossing it meant almost certain death. Yet attacks were ordered again and again. Generals believed that massive bombardments followed by infantry advances could break the stalemate. The results were catastrophic. Thousands of men were killed in a single morning, advancing into machine gun fire for the sake of a few hundred yards of ground. But even amid the destruction, soldiers adapted. They built small comforts into their grim environment. They cooked tea over makeshift stoves, wrote letters to families, and carved furniture from wooden crates. In some sectors, they even cultivated small gardens using tins and shell casings as pots. Life went on in the strangest of ways. The weather shaped everything. In winter, frostbite was common. In spring, the thaw turned the trenches into mud baths so deep that men could drown if they slipped in. In summer, the smell intensified, and diseases like dysentery spread rapidly. Flies covered every surface, drawn by the waste and decay. Trench foot, caused by prolonged exposure to damp conditions, rotted the skin and flesh of soldiers' feet. The cure was simple in theory: keep your feet dry. In practice, that was nearly impossible. Soldiers were ordered to remove their boots and massage their feet daily, but when the mud was waist deep, such orders felt absurd. Communication between front and rear was a constant challenge. Messages were carried by runners, signal flares, or carrier pigeons. The pigeons were surprisingly reliable and became vital to the war effort. One famous bird, named Cherami, carried a message that saved nearly 200 American soldiers trapped behind enemy lines in 1918. The pigeons were honored, sometimes even awarded medals. It was one of the few bright spots in a landscape otherwise defined by human suffering. Despite the horror, camaraderie grew among the men. They called themselves trench brothers. Shared hardship created bonds that transcended class and rank. A farm labourer from Yorkshire might find himself fighting beside a Cambridge student or a miner from Wales, and in the mud, distinctions faded. What mattered was endurance, the quiet, stubborn determination to survive another day. The soldiers' humour reflected their resilience. Trench newspapers, handwritten or printed on makeshift presses, circulated among the units. Titles like the Wipers Times, a play on Why Prez. The Belgian town published satirical articles, poems, and fake advertisements. One issue joked about the great new invention, mud-repellent socks, and the perfect cure for lice. Don't think about them. In a place where laughter was rare, these papers became a lifeline. Behind the lines, supply chains stretched for miles. Everything, ammunition, food, medical supplies, had to be transported through muddy roads under threat of shellfire. A single meal might require a dozen different logistical steps: flour baked into bread miles away, loaded onto wagons, carried by mules, and finally distributed by ration parties under cover of night. Soldiers ate bully beef, tinned corned beef, hard biscuits, and sometimes stews made from questionable ingredients. Fresh food was a luxury. Tea and cigarettes were as essential as ammunition. Medical care was rudimentary. Field medics worked under constant danger, tending to the wounded in dugouts or makeshift dressing stations. From there, men were carried by stretcher bearers to casualty clearing stations, then to hospitals behind the front. The chain of evacuation was long and perilous. Many died before reaching safety. The lucky ones returned home, scarred in body or mind. As the war dragged on, innovations emerged. Gas masks were developed after the first chlorine attacks in 1915. Helmets replaced soft caps. Trench periscopes allowed soldiers to observe without exposing themselves to snipers. Tanks appeared in 1916, lumbering across the battlefield like iron beasts. Yet for all these advances, the essential conditions of trench life remained unchanged: mud, fear, exhaustion, and endurance. And still, they fought on. In December 1914, during the first winter of the war, an extraordinary event occurred. Along parts of the Western Front, soldiers from both sides emerged from their trenches on Christmas Eve. They met in no man's land, exchanged small gifts, and sang carols. For a few brief hours, the guns fell silent. Footballs appeared, and impromptu matches were played in the snow. It was not universal, nor officially sanctioned, but it revealed something profound: the shared humanity that persisted even in the darkest circumstances. When morning came, they returned to their trenches, and the war resumed. The soldiers who lived through those years became witnesses to a new kind of warfare, industrialized, impersonal, and relentless. Many would never forget the sights and sounds of the trenches: the scream of shells, the cold grip of mud, the flicker of a candle in a dugout, the whisper of a rat in the night. And yet, one question lingered among those who survived the early years: how long could this stalemate last? How many more lives would be consumed by the mud before someone, somewhere, decided it was enough? The soldiers waited. The generals planned. The world held its breath. The longer the war continued, the more the trenches became a world unto themselves, a grim ecosystem sustained by routine, discipline, and endurance. What had begun as temporary defences evolved into semi-permanent settlements carved deep into the French and Belgian countryside. In this strange, subterranean existence, men learned not only to fight but to live. To survive the monotony and terror, they clung to the ordinary details of daily life: shaving with cold water, writing letters, cleaning rifles, and waiting for the next roll call. By 1916, the trenches had taken on a kind of order. Each army developed its own systems for rotation and rest. The front line was the most dangerous, exposed to sniper fire, shelling, and gas attacks. Behind it lay the support and reserve trenches, connected by communication lines. A soldier might spend 4 or 5 days in the front line, then be rotated to the rear for a few days of relative calm before returning again. This cycle continued endlessly, broken only by major offensives or injuries. The front line trenches were narrow, sometimes barely 2 feet wide. Wooden planks reinforced the sides, though these were often soaked and collapsing. Dugouts, small underground shelters lined with timber, offered minimal protection from the weather and bombardment. Officers sometimes had better accommodations, with candles, small tables, and even stoves. But for most soldiers, comfort was a memory. They slept sitting up, wrapped in damp blankets, listening to the drip of water and the scratching of rats. Rats were more than a nuisance. They were part of the environment, as inevitable as mud or lice. Soldiers described how they could feel them moving over their bodies at night, nibbling at scraps of food or even gnawing on sleeping men's boots. The creatures multiplied by the thousands, feeding on corpses left in shallow graves or no man's land. One French soldier wrote in his diary, "They were as bold as officers and as numerous as the bullets. Attempts to control them rarely worked." Cats and terriers were brought to the front, but the rats always returned. The men grew accustomed to their presence, speaking of them with dark humor, as though the rats too were comrades in arms. Survivors of the same miserable war, lice were another unrelenting plague. Known as chats or seam squirrels, they infested every layer of clothing. Soldiers scratched constantly, and the bites left raw sores that could become infected. Hot baths were a luxury. Delousing stations, when available, offered only brief relief. Uniforms were often boiled to kill the insects, but within days the itching returned. Some soldiers joked that lice were the true victors of the war, feeding on both sides without discrimination. Disease followed inevitably. Trench fever, spread by lice, caused high fevers, headaches, and muscle pain so severe that men could not stand. Dysentery, spread by contaminated water and poor sanitation, left soldiers weak and dehydrated. Medical officers did what they could, but hygiene was nearly impossible to maintain. The constant dampness bred rot and mold. The smell of waste, sweat, decay, and disinfectant was omnipresent. And yet, life continued. Mail from home was a lifeline. Letters were censored, but they carried fragments of normalcy, news of harvests, births, and the weather back home. Soldiers wrote as often as they could, sometimes daily, using the dim light of candles or matches. Many described their surroundings in vague, sanitized terms, not wanting to worry their families. "We are safe and dry," they would write, though both were rarely true. Some letters never reached their destinations, lost to shell fire or buried in the mud. But those that did were treasured, read and reread until the paper fell apart. Food was another constant preoccupation. Army rations were monotonous but dependable: tinned beef, hard biscuits, bread, and occasionally stew. The British soldiers nicknamed their corned beef bully beef, and the hard biscuits tooth breakers. The French were slightly better off with bread, wine, and tinned sardines. Still, supply shortages meant that meals were often cold, and fresh food was rare. When possible, soldiers supplemented their rations with foraged vegetables, parcels from home, or trade with local farmers. Tea, though, was sacred, brewed whenever water and fuel could be found. Even in the mud, the ritual of tea offered a moment of warmth and normalcy. Water was both essential and dangerous. Wells were often contaminated, and rainwater collected in shell holes was filled with filth and decay. Soldiers learned to strain and boil water when they could, but many drank whatever was available. Dehydration and stomach illnesses were constant threats. The irony was bitter, surrounded by mud and water, yet often dying of thirst. During quieter periods, soldiers found ways to occupy their minds. Some carved intricate figures from spent shell casings or chalk. Others played cards, sang songs, or wrote poetry. Education programs were even introduced in some units, where soldiers studied languages, mathematics, or engineering during their rest rotations. The war, it seemed, could not extinguish curiosity. The human mind reached for distraction, even in the darkest places. Art and poetry flourished in unexpected ways. The English soldier poets, Wilfred Owen, Siegfried Sassoon, and others, began to capture the strange duality of the trench's beauty amid horror, comradeship amid despair. Their words later became the enduring voice of a generation silenced too soon. Owen would write, "What passing, bells for these who die as cattle." Only the monstrous anger of the guns. But for every poet, there were thousands of men whose stories remained unwritten. Ordinary soldiers whose daily endurance was their only legacy. Religious faith varied. Some found solace in prayer, others abandoned belief altogether. Chaplains held simple services in dugouts or open fields, reading psalms over the sound of distant artillery. Funerals, when possible, were brief and quiet. Often, bodies were buried where they fell, marked with improvised crosses. Soldiers tried to give each other dignity in death, even when the earth refused to stay still long enough to hold them. Technology brought new horrors. The first gas attacks in 1915 had terrified the world. Chlorine and later phosgene and mustard gas caused choking, blindness, and burns. Gas masks became standard issue, but their effectiveness varied. Soldiers learned to recognize the signs. The faint greenish cloud rolling low over the fields, the shouted warning of "Gas! Gas!" echoing down the trenches. Even years later, veterans would remember the smell, sharp, metallic, unforgettable. Artillery, however, remained the true killer. Over 60% of the war's casualties were caused by shells. The ground shook constantly, sometimes for days. Men learned to recognize different types of shells by their sound. The high whine of a German whiz, bang. The slow growl of a heavy howitzer. Sleep was nearly impossible. Some soldiers became so accustomed to the noise that silence felt alien, almost frightening. When the shelling stopped, they could hear the creak of the earth, the dripping of water, and the faint scurry of rats. Sounds of life returning to a landscape of death. Between bombardments, there were patrols and raids. Small groups were sent into no man's land under cover of darkness to gather intelligence or capture prisoners. These missions were perilous. A misstep could mean death. The mud was so deep in places that soldiers tied themselves together with ropes to avoid sinking. They moved slowly, whispering, every sound amplified by fear. Some never returned. Their bodies vanished into the craters, lost forever. And yet, amidst all this, there were moments of absurd normality. In certain sectors, truces of convenience emerged. Soldiers on both sides agreed informally to avoid firing during meal times or to warn each other before bombardments. There were even exchanges of newspapers or small goods across no man's land, though such actions were officially forbidden. War, it seemed, had its own strange etiquette. Medical innovation grew out of necessity. The constant injuries led to advances in surgery, blood transfusions and prosthetics. Mobile operating theaters, known as casualty clearing stations, moved closer to the front. Nurses, many of them volunteers, worked tirelessly under appalling conditions. The famous angels of mercy, as soldiers called them, risked their lives daily. Their work saved countless others, though the psychological toll was immense. One nurse wrote in her diary, "We clean them, comfort them, and send them to die again." The war never ends. Even when the guns are silent, the officers too bore heavy burdens. Contrary to popular myth, many shared the same dangers as their men. They led attacks, slept in the same trenches, and suffered the same losses. But they also carried the weight of command, the impossible decisions that sent hundreds to their deaths for a few yards of ground. Letters home from officers often reflect a quiet despair, tempered by duty. One captain wrote, "I cannot think of victory, only of endurance. Each day we hold, and that must be enough." The longer the war dragged on, the more abstract its purpose became. Soldiers no longer spoke of victory or glory. They spoke instead of survival, of the next meal, of the next sunrise. Propaganda posters back home still promised honor and patriotism, but in the trenches, those words meant little. Reality was measured in inches of mud and minutes of calm. By late 1916, with battles like the Somme and Verdun claiming hundreds of thousands of lives, exhaustion seeped into every layer of the armies. The soldiers had become part of the landscape. Ghosts moving through fog and shellfire. Their letters grew shorter, their humor darker, their patience thinner. The rats still thrived, the mud still clung, the guns still roared, and yet the war machine kept turning. Supplies flowed, orders arrived, and men marched to replace the fallen. The trenches deepened, the wire thickened, and the cycle continued. In the midst of all this monotony and death, one question persisted among the men: if neither side could advance, and neither could retreat, what was the point of holding the line? Was survival itself the only victory left? By the time the war staggered toward its conclusion in late 1918, the trenches had become as familiar to the soldiers as their own homes. They were homes built of mud, fear, and endurance. An entire subterranean civilization of waiting men. For those who had survived since 1914, the front had aged them beyond recognition. They had seen empires fall apart and friends vanish into shell holes that had no names. 4 years of stalemate had turned the Western Front into a scar across the face of Europe. The land itself had changed. Forests were shredded, rivers poisoned, villages reduced to rubble. Even the seasons seemed different. The mud in Flanders had soaked up so much blood oil and gas residue that it never quite dried. Everything smelled faintly of rotten iron. And yet, in early 1918 there were rumors, whispers passed from trench to trench, that something was shifting. Germany, worn thin by the naval blockade, had launched one final offensive in the spring. It was powerful and terrifying, sweeping across the old battlefields with speed unseen since 1914. The Allied lines buckled but did not break. When the momentum failed, the German army found itself overstretched and exhausted. By the summer, the Allies counterattacked. Slowly, painfully, the tide turned. But for the men in the trenches, this turning tide felt like every other month of the war. The same routine, the same mud, the same hunger. Even as the front lines moved, the world seemed trapped in its old rhythm. Bombardments, raids, roll calls, and silence. The supply lines grew more efficient, and the technology of killing more refined. Tanks rumbled forward in greater numbers now, crude but effective. Airplanes, once little more than novelty machines, darkened the skies. Pilots fought duels above the trenches while, below, men still drowned in the mud. The contrast was almost absurd. A modern war fought with medieval suffering. Letters home from 1918 reveal an exhaustion beyond words. "We no longer fear death," one British soldier wrote. "We simply fear that it will never end." Another described the front as a waiting room for eternity. The final months brought new horrors. The Spanish flu began to sweep through the ranks, killing men faster than bullets. Soldiers would cough blood into their gas masks, unsure whether the tightness in their chest came from disease or another gas attack. Doctors did what they could, but hospitals were already overflowing. Death, which had once been loud and sudden, became quiet and invisible. By October, German morale was collapsing. Desertions increased, officers struggled to maintain order. Food shortages and strikes at home eroded the last remnants of the old empire's strength. The Allies pressed forward cautiously, unsure if the end was truly near. The word armistice began to circulate, tentatively at first, then with growing certainty. And then, on the morning of November 11, 1918, the guns fell silent. At exactly 1100 a.m., the war that had consumed millions ended with a sound almost no one recognized any more: quiet. Soldiers stood in disbelief. For some, tears came unbidden. For others, nothing. The silence was too heavy, too strange. A few men shouted, threw helmets into the air, or embraced one another. Others simply sat down and stared at the ground. The rats kept moving, unaware that the world had changed. In London and Paris, crowds celebrated in the streets. Bells rang, flags waved, and the word victory filled the air. But in the trenches, victory was a hollow thing. The survivors had seen too much. They looked around at the shattered earth, at the wooden crosses marking uncounted graves, and wondered what exactly had been won. The process of leaving the front was slow and uneven. Demobilization took months. Entire divisions waited in the same trenches long after the armistice, uncertain when they could finally go home. They dismantled sandbags, filled in dugouts, and cleared barbed wire, an effort to erase the war's physical traces. But the war had left marks that no spade could bury. When the soldiers finally returned home, they carried the trenches with them. The mud was gone from their boots, but not from their memories. They spoke little of what they had seen. Many found it difficult to adjust to civilian life. The world had moved on without them, yet nothing felt normal. The rhythm of peacetime was too soft, too quiet. Loud noises made them flinch. Open fields made them uneasy. Some found comfort in silence, others could not bear it. Governments called them heroes, but few felt like heroes. They were survivors of mud, disease, and monotony. The lost generation, as they came to be known, drifted through the 1920s haunted by the ghosts of their youth. Some turned to writing or painting, trying to capture what words could barely contain. Others simply endured, as they always had. Back in France and Belgium, the land began to heal, but slowly. Farmers returned to find fields filled with unexploded shells and bones. The old front lines became memorials, cemeteries, and forests of white crosses. Some trenches were left as they were, preserved in silence as reminders. Others were reclaimed by the earth, swallowed by grass and rain. Historians would later study the war in terms of battles, alliances, and treaties. They would map the front lines, measure the losses, and analyze the politics that led to it all. But the soldiers who had lived in the trenches remembered it differently. For them, history was not made in grand decisions, but in the small details: a cup of tea in the cold, a letter from home, the sound of boots squelching through mud. One veteran, decades later, described it this way: "It wasn't the fighting that broke us. It was the waiting. The endless waiting between bombardments, between attacks, between letters. You lived in borrowed time, and you learned to be quiet about it. Even the animals of the trenches, those uninvited companions, left their mark. The rats, the lice, the carrier pigeons, and the horses that hauled supplies through the mud became symbols of endurance." In the quiet years after the war, soldiers spoke of them with a strange affection. "The rats kept us company," one man wrote. "They didn't care who won. They just lived like we did." The war's end did not bring peace of mind. The years that followed were marked by a collective amnesia, a desire to forget, to bury the mud beneath monuments and marble. But the scars were deeper than the ground. The trench lines might have been filled in, but they remained etched into the minds of millions. The physical reconstruction of Europe was immense. Entire towns had to be rebuilt from foundations up. Roads were cleared of wreckage. Barbed wire was gathered and melted down. The Zone Rouge, in northern France, an area so heavily contaminated with unexploded shells and corpses that it was declared uninhabitable, remains restricted even a century later. Nature eventually reclaimed much of it, but beneath the green grass still lie the remnants of that industrialized nightmare. And what of the ordinary soldier? Many returned to find no work waiting, their old jobs gone or filled by others. Some were crippled or blinded, others unable to speak. The early 20th century was ill, equipped to understand the invisible wounds of war. Shell shock was still considered weakness by many officers and doctors. Men who trembled uncontrollably or screamed in their sleep were often dismissed as cowards rather than casualties. Only later would the psychological toll be fully recognized. Societies changed in subtle but profound ways. The war had erased old hierarchies and accelerated technological progress, but it had also deepened cynicism. The idea of glory in war, so strong in 1942, had evaporated. In its place was something quieter, a wary recognition of human endurance. The soldiers who had spent years in the mud learned a kind of stoicism that would define their generation. They had witnessed the limits of human suffering and discovered, to their surprise, that they could survive it. For many, that knowledge was both a comfort and a curse. Years later, as Europe drifted once again toward conflict in the 1930s, veterans of the trenches watched with disbelief. They had fought, they thought, the war to end all wars. And yet, history seemed determined to repeat itself. Some warned, others stayed silent. They knew that those who had not lived through the mud could never truly understand it. Even today, the traces remain. Along the old Western Front, visitors can walk through reconstructed trenches, safe, clean, drained of their terror. They see the sandbags, the duckboards, the narrow dugouts. They read the plaques and stand in silence before endless rows of crosses. It is peaceful now, but the air still feels heavy as though it remembers. The rats are gone, mostly. The mud is grass. The guns are silent. But beneath the soil lie the rusted remains of helmets, rifles and bones, an archaeology of endurance. And somewhere in the quiet earth of northern France, there is still a soldier's tin mug, dented and filled with dried mud. On its side, scratched in shaky letters, are the words, "Home soon." He never was. The story of the trenches is not one of glory, but of persistence. It is a reminder that history is not always made by generals or kings, but by ordinary people who endure the unendurable. The Western Front was not merely a place of death. It was a strange, living organism, made of men who refused to surrender to despair. And perhaps, if there is one lesson to take from that long, slow agony, it is this: even in the darkest, most monotonous corners of history, the human spirit finds a way to continue, quietly, stubbornly, like a rat in the trench, surviving because it must. You wouldn't have noticed him at first. He was a small, pale boy with sharp eyes and an expression of constant concentration, the kind of child who seemed to listen not just to people but to silence itself. His name was Johann Karl Friedrich Gauss, and he was born on April 30th, 1777, in the small duchy of Brunswick, in what is now Germany. The late 18th century was not an age of luxury for the working class. The air in Brunswick smelled faintly of coal smoke and horses. The streets were narrow, lined with wooden houses that leaned slightly, as though they too were wary of standing. Gauss's father, Gebhard, worked as a bricklayer and gardener, honest labor, but not well paid. His mother, Dorothea, was illiterate but devoted to her son's education. She could not have known that her child would one day become one of the most extraordinary minds in the history of mathematics. Gauss himself later said that he could calculate before he could speak. That may not have been entirely true, but it captures something essential about him. Numbers seem to come naturally, as if they were not learned but remembered. One story, told and retold by generations of teachers, has him, at the age of 7, astonishing his schoolmaster. The class had been assigned busy work to add all the numbers from 1 to 100. Most children sighed and began slowly scratching on their slates, but young Karl finished almost immediately. His teacher, surprised, asked how. Gauss explained that he had noticed something: the first and last numbers always add up to 101 or 1 100, 2 to 99, and so on. There were 50 pairs in all, so the sum was simply 5001 to 5050. That single moment captured something timeless about his mind, a preference for patterns over process, for seeing the whole rather than trudging through the parts. It also foreshadowed a lifetime of insights that would reshape how humanity understood not only mathematics, but space itself. Yet in those early years, he was simply a poor boy with a gift. His father, practical and stern, saw little use for abstract numbers. He wanted his son to learn a trade, perhaps in masonry or bookkeeping. But others saw what Jabard could not. Gauss's teacher, recognizing his brilliance, arranged for him to study further. He brought the boy's abilities to the attention of the Duke of Brunswick, who provided financial support for Karl's education. And so, quietly, in the flicker of candlelight over worn textbooks, the foundation of modern mathematics began to take shape. In the 1780s, education was slow and methodical. There were no calculators, no blackboards full of equations, just quills, ink, and the patience to copy figures carefully. Gauss devoured whatever he could find: arithmetic, geometry, Latin, and eventually astronomy. His notebooks, still preserved today, are filled with neat, exact handwriting, as if precision itself was a moral duty. He moved on to the Collegium Carolinum in Brunswick at age 15, and later to the University of Göttingen, one of the few centers of higher learning in Europe that encouraged mathematical research. Göttingen was a quiet town of cobblestone streets and old churches. Its libraries smelled of dust and ink, and its scholars walked slowly, wrapped in long coats against the northern chill. It was here that Gauss first encountered the wider world of mathematics, the great names of antiquity: Euclid, Archimedes, and Pythagoras. But he did not revere them as untouchable masters. He treated them instead as companions in thought, minds he could meet across centuries. By the age of 18, Gauss had begun exploring the mysterious patterns of numbers that would later define his life's work. Primes, prime numbers, the indivisible atoms of arithmetic, had fascinated mathematicians for thousands of years. They appeared irregular, almost random, yet Gauss sensed that some deeper order governed them. He filled page after page with calculations, seeking the hidden rhythm beneath the apparent chaos. One summer evening in 1796, as twilight spread over Göttingen, Gauss discovered something that would change mathematics forever. He found a way to construct a 17-sided polygon using only a compass and straightedge, a problem unsolved since the time of the ancient Greeks. This discovery, simple in form but profound in meaning, marked the rebirth of geometry after 2 millennia of stagnation. He noted it in his diary with characteristic brevity. Eureka! A 17 can be constructed. No exclamation marks, no lengthy explanation. Just a simple statement, like a craftsman quietly setting down his tools after finishing a perfect piece of work. This was how Gauss lived, with restraint, discipline, and silence. He disliked public attention and rarely spoke of his discoveries until he was certain of their perfection. Many of his findings remained unpublished for years, written neatly in notebooks he called his Theorema Aureum, his golden theorems. He once remarked, "Few people have the imagination for reality." For Gauss, imagination and precision were not opposites but partners. To him, numbers were not abstractions, they were real, as tangible as bricks in a wall or stars in the sky. But for all his intellectual brilliance, Gauss's life was not grand or dramatic. It was quiet, even monotonous. He lived in small rooms filled with books and papers, following a strict routine: study, calculate, record, and repeat. He disliked travel, preferred solitude, and often seemed detached from the world around him. Those who knew him described him as polite but distant. His humor was rare and dry. His passions were mathematics, astronomy, and order, everything that could be measured and understood. He had little interest in politics or fashion. He once attended a royal banquet, spent the entire evening calculating mentally, and left without speaking to anyone. Still, there were glimpses of warmth beneath the precision. He married in 1805 to Johanna Osthoff, a gentle and educated woman who brought light to his otherwise austere world. They had 3 children, and for a brief time, his letters reveal an uncharacteristic tenderness. He wrote to a friend that he had finally found a home for the soul. That peace was short-lived. Johanna died in 1809 after complications from childbirth. Gauss was devastated. In his diary, he noted the date and time of her death with clinical precision. But beneath the numbers, grief pulsed quietly. Within a year, he married again to Minna Waldeck, with whom he had 3 more children. But those who knew him said that he was never quite the same. He withdrew further into his work, letting equations absorb his sorrow. In the years that followed, Gauss turned his attention to the heavens. Astronomy, in the early 19th century, was a science of patience and persistence. Observers charted the night sky by hand using telescopes barely more powerful than modern binoculars. Data arrived slowly, often days or weeks apart, and each calculation required hours of painstaking effort. In 1801, a new celestial object had been discovered, Ceres, the first known asteroid, but it vanished soon after, lost in the sun's glare. Astronomers across Europe were unable to locate it again. Gauss, still in his 20s, took the sparse data they had, just 3 observations, and applied his own mathematical methods to predict its orbit. His calculations were meticulous. He worked for weeks in silence, testing, correcting, refining. When his results were sent to the observatories, they found Ceres exactly where Gauss said it would be. The accuracy stunned the scientific world. Overnight, the young mathematician became a legend among astronomers. But Gauss himself remained unimpressed. "I could not sleep until it was found," he said simply. It was not pride that drove him, but an inner necessity, the compulsion to make sense of things. He would later design new methods of data analysis, invent the mathematical foundation for statistics, and develop concepts that would eventually shape Einstein's theory of relativity. But in his own time, Gauss lived quietly, writing, teaching, and calculating late into the night by candlelight. His home in Göttingen was filled with books, instruments, and the slow ticking of clocks. He kept detailed records of his observations, every star measured, every angle noted to the nearest second. He disliked assistance and rarely collaborated. His handwriting was so neat that it seemed mechanical, and his notebooks were models of discipline. To outsiders, it might have seemed a dull life, a man alone with his numbers, but to Gauss, the universe itself was written in the language of mathematics, and every calculation was a glimpse of eternity. There is a quiet beauty in such devotion. It lacks the drama of battlefields or revolutions, yet it speaks of a different kind of courage, the courage to confront the infinite with only one's mind. As he grew older, Gauss's fame spread, though he remained indifferent to it. Scholars sought his advice, kings offered him honors. He accepted some, declined others, always with polite detachment. He disliked unnecessary words. When his students asked him how he achieved such perfection in his work, he replied simply, "It is not enough to know, one must understand." By his middle years, Gauss had become a figure of quiet authority, a man who measured not just the earth and sky, but the limits of human thought. His research in geodesy, the measurement of the earth's shape, led him through forests and hills with surveying instruments, mapping the land of Hanover with the same care he once gave to the stars. Even then, he found patterns others missed. The curve of a hill, the deviation of a compass needle, all were, to him, signs of a deeper order. But behind the calm precision of his work lay a question that haunted him, a question that would shape his later life. If mathematics could describe the world so perfectly, where did that perfection come from? Was it born in the human mind, or was it woven into the fabric of the universe itself? That quiet question would lead him into the deepest realms of geometry and theory, into ideas that would eventually redefine how we think about space, time, and reality. By the year 1816, the streets of Rat-Infested were as grey and slow as the mists that rolled over them in winter. The Napoleonic Wars had ended, leaving Europe exhausted and uncertain. Empires were reshaping themselves, borders were redrawn with ink and grief. But in Gauss's small observatory at the edge of the university, life followed a different rhythm. There, among brass instruments and notebooks filled with elegant figures, time was measured not by human history, but by celestial motion. Gauss was in his late 30s, precise, meticulous, and already wary of fame. His colleagues called him the Prince of Mathematicians, but he disliked the title. He saw no royalty in logic, only responsibility. The task of the mathematician, he once said, was to discover the simple truth hidden by the apparent complexity of the world. The complexity he now faced was immense. The Kingdom of Hanover, of which Göttingen was a part, had commissioned a grand survey, a complete geodetic mapping of its territory. The goal was simple on paper: to measure every mountain, river, and boundary with unprecedented accuracy. In reality, it was one of the most demanding scientific projects of the age. To most, this would have been a bureaucratic assignment. But to Gauss, it was an opportunity, a way to test whether the geometry of the Earth matched the geometry of thought. He began in 1818, traveling across northern Germany with a team of assistants, heavy instruments and reams of paper. They carried theodolites, precise devices of polished brass used to measure angles, and long iron rods for distances. At each chosen hilltop, they built signal towers, often out of wood, sometimes out of stone. Then, on clear nights, they used reflected lantern light to sight one tower from another, forming vast triangles across the landscape. Each angle, each measurement, was written carefully in Gauss's notebooks. He calculated relentlessly, often in the field, sometimes under a tent or a fading lamp. When others rested, he corrected decimals. To most, the work was tedious. To Gauss, it was sublime. He noticed something peculiar. When the sum of the angles in his great triangles was measured, it did not always equal exactly 180 degrees. The deviation was small, barely perceptible, but it was there. Some would have dismissed it as experimental error. Gauss, however, was not so sure. For centuries, Euclid's geometry, the geometry of flat planes, had been accepted as absolute. Every schoolboy learned its axioms: parallel lines never meet. The shortest distance between 2 points is a straight line. The sum of the angles in a triangle is always 180 degrees. But now, standing on the rolling hills of Hanover, Gauss began to suspect that these truths might not hold universally. He wondered, what if space itself was curved? What if the geometry that governed our measurements was not merely a property of thought, but of the physical world? He did not speak of this publicly. The idea was too radical, and Gauss disliked controversy. He shared it only with a few close correspondents, among them Farkas Bolyai, a Hungarian mathematician and old friend. In a letter from 1824, Gauss confessed that he had developed a geometry entirely different from ours, one in which parallel lines could diverge or converge depending on the curvature of space. He wrote, "I do not want to risk the outcry of the Boeotians if I were to publish my views." The Boeotians, in ancient Greek terms, were the unthinking masses. Gauss, ever cautious, chose silence over premature revelation. Still, he continued to test his ideas indirectly, using the data from his surveys. He knew that the Earth's surface was not flat but curved. A sphere, or rather an ellipsoid. What intrigued him was whether this curvature extended beyond the Earth, whether the entire universe might follow similar laws. In quiet moments between calculations, he would look up at the night sky and imagine space not as a vast empty expanse, but as something alive with form, bent, folded, and subtly shaped. While these thoughts occupied him, life in Göttingen moved at its steady, provincial pace. Students came and went, the seasons turned, and Gauss aged slowly, as if time respected his precision. His second wife, Minna, was often ill. The household, though respectable, was austere. Gauss himself was known to be difficult, sometimes irritable, often withdrawn. He demanded perfection from everyone, including his children, few of whom inherited his mathematical talent. His eldest son, Joseph, longed to emigrate to America, but Gauss refused to support him, dismissing the idea as foolish. "There," he wrote sternly, "is no culture, only wilderness." He spoke rarely of personal feelings, though his private letters revealed traces of melancholy. He seemed trapped between two worlds: the infinite universe of his intellect and the small, constraining routines of daily life. His colleagues admired him but found him unapproachable. Some even feared him, and yet amid this quiet isolation his work flourished. In 1827 he published one of his most profound contributions, Disquisitions generales circa superficies curvas, General Investigations on Curved Surfaces. The title was unassuming, but its content was revolutionary. In it, Gauss formalized the mathematics of curvature, defining how surfaces bend and twist in space. He proved that the curvature of a surface depends only on measurements made within that surface itself, not on how it sits in higher dimensional space. This insight, now known as Gauss's Theorema Egregium or Remarkable Theorem, quietly redefined geometry. In essence, Gauss had shown that one could determine whether a world was curved simply by living within it. No external perspective was required. It was a thought so deep that its full implications would not be understood until a century later, when Einstein used it as a foundation for general relativity. At the time, though, Gauss said little. His paper, written in Latin and filled with dense equations, was read by few and understood by fewer. But to those who did grasp its meaning, it was clear that something monumental had occurred, a shift in the very fabric of mathematical thought. Still, the daily rhythm of Gauss's life did not change. He rose early, read the newspapers, worked through the morning, and spent his afternoons on astronomical observations. At night, he would often sit alone, calculating silently by candlelight, the faint smell of wax and ink filling his study. Outside, Göttingen slept. Inside, Gauss measured infinity. He corresponded with other mathematicians, Jacobi, Bessel, Schumacher, but his letters were famously terse. He offered criticism sparingly but sharply. When a young mathematician sent him a paper with an error, Gauss responded with the single word errare, you err. His intellectual discipline bordered on asceticism. He believed that true discovery came only through persistence, through what he called porca sed matura, few, but ripe. He published little, but every publication was perfect. Even his handwriting reflected his philosophy, steady, symmetrical, and unwavering. His notebooks from this period, still preserved in the Göttingen archives, are works of art, numbers arranged like architecture, precise and silent. He once remarked that mathematics is the queen of the sciences, and that arithmetic is the queen of mathematics. Yet for him, these were not words of pride, but of duty. To study mathematics was to serve order itself, to glimpse the divine logic underlying chaos. The 1830s brought new challenges. His work in magnetism, conducted in collaboration with the physicist Wilhelm Weber, drew him reluctantly into experimental science. Together, they built one of the world's first electromagnetic telegraphs, a simple wire stretching across Göttingen that could transmit coded signals. To most observers, it was a curiosity, an academic exercise, but Gauss recognized its potential. He saw that information could be moved not by matter but by force, by invisible fields. He did not pursue it commercially, of course. He had no interest in profit. Yet in his quiet way, he had helped to invent the modern age of communication. It was another irony of his life. The man who preferred silence had created a machine for speaking across distance. As the years passed, Gauss's health began to decline. His back stooped, his hair thinned, but his eyes remained sharp. He continued to calculate until the very end, often correcting the work of younger scholars with dry precision. He was not sentimental about aging. "I have lived long enough," he once said, "to see the world's stupidity endure." Yet he continued his routine faithfully work, reflection, and long walks through Göttingen's quiet streets. He found solace, perhaps, in the consistency of things, the slow turning of the heavens, the unchanging beauty of numbers. And yet, beneath his calm exterior, a restlessness persisted. His explorations of curved surfaces had opened questions that even he could not fully answer. If space itself could be curved, what did that mean for reality? Was the universe finite or infinite? Did geometry describe truth, or merely our limited way of perceiving it? These were questions that Gauss, despite all his genius, could not resolve completely. They lingered in his notebooks, unanswered but alive. He once wrote in his diary, late in life, "I have had my share of discoveries, yet I feel as though I have merely scratched the surface of what is." In those words lies the paradox of Gauss as a man who mapped the earth, measured the heavens, and still felt that the greatest truths remained just beyond calculation. He was a mathematician, yes, but also a philosopher in numbers, a man who stared into infinity and saw both beauty and mystery. And as he approached the final years of his life, that quiet mystery deepened. The patterns he had uncovered, of curvature, of motion, of invisible forces, began to suggest something vast and unfinished. What if, he wondered, even reality itself was only an approximation, a shadow of some greater, perfect order? That question would haunt his final days, echoing softly through the observatory where he had spent his life. In the winter of 1849, the snow fell silently over Göttingen. The university town had changed little in half a century. Students still hurried across cobbled streets with books under their arms. The same bells still marked the hours, but in a narrow house near the observatory, the aging Carl Friedrich Gauss continued his patient work, as he had done every day for nearly 60 years. By now, his hands trembled slightly when he wrote. His hair had turned white, and the once keen lines of his face had softened into fatigue. Yet his eyes, grey and calm, still held the same unflinching focus that had defined his youth. He worked alone most mornings, surrounded by stacks of ledgers, astronomical charts, and precise tables of numbers. The sound of the pendulum clock in the corner filled the room, steady, mechanical, relentless. Every few minutes he would pause, dip his pen in ink, and continue his calculations. It was the rhythm of a lifetime. Outside, revolutions were stirring once again. Europe in the mid-19th century was restless with change. Industrial power rising, old empires trembling, ideas of democracy and science reshaping society. Trains now cut across the countryside that Gauss had once measured on foot. Telegraph wires stretched above the fields, humming faintly with messages. The world was beginning to move faster, but Gauss remained still. His life, like his mathematics, was ruled by precision and order. He disliked disorder in any form, in speech, in manners, or in thought. Even his meals were taken at the same time each day. And yet, in the stillness of his study, something deeper stirred. A a sense that his life's work was nearing completion, though the universe itself remained unfinished. He was now the director of the Göttingen Observatory, a title he accepted not out of ambition but obligation. He preferred solitude to administration. Still, he managed the observatory efficiently, if coldly, demanding accuracy from his assistants that bordered on the impossible. One of them, a young astronomer named Johann Encke, once remarked that Gauss's standards were inhumanly exact. A single misplaced decimal could send him into quiet fury, but Gauss rarely shouted. His disapproval was worse when silent, a tightening of the lips, a faint shake of the head. He believed that in science, as in life, small errors revealed deeper flaws of character. Precision was a form of morality, and yet, for all his sternness, Gauss's true battles were inward. His mind remained restless, circling the same unsolved questions that had haunted him for decades, about the nature of number, the shape of space, and the order of the cosmos. He continued to refine his Disquisitiones Arithmetica, the monumental work he had written half a century earlier, a book that had quietly redefined number theory. He also revisited his earlier discoveries in geometry, still unsatisfied, still searching for something more complete. It was as though he could never stop measuring, not just the Earth, but the boundaries of understanding itself. His personal life, by contrast, was marked by distance. His children had grown and gone. Some disappointed him, others he simply could not understand. His second wife, Minna, had died years earlier, leaving him alone except for his daughter, the Ries, who managed his household. The Ries adored him, but even she admitted that her father lived in another world. He would spend hours in silent thought, eyes fixed on nothing, lips moving faintly as though in prayer. At such times, she knew not to disturb him. Visitors found him courteous but detached. He spoke sparingly, often shifting conversations back to mathematics, astronomy, or when pressed, philosophy. When asked about God, he would say only, "There are things we cannot measure." He neither denied nor affirmed faith, he simply withheld judgment. For him, belief and knowledge were separate realms, and he chose the latter. Despite his isolation, the scientific world outside continued to revolve around him. His correspondence stretched across Europe, to mathematicians in France, England, Russia, and beyond. He read every paper that reached him, annotating them in neat handwriting, sometimes with single word critiques like trivial, incorrect, or elegant. Younger scientists revered him but feared him. Many sought his approval, few received it. He demanded not only rigor but clarity, the ability to express complex ideas with perfect simplicity. When one young mathematician asked him what made a discovery beautiful, Gauss replied, "That which can no longer be improved." He measured beauty the same way he measured truth, by its completeness. Yet even in his old age, Gauss's mind remained curious about the unseen world. He followed developments in magnetism and electricity with fascination, often discussing them with Wilhelm Weber, his longtime collaborator. Together they had devised new instruments to measure magnetic fields and track their fluctuations over time. In 1832, they had even constructed a working electromagnetic telegraph, one of the first of its kind. Using two coils connected by a wire stretched across the Göttingen campus, they could send messages by deflecting a magnetic needle. It was a marvel of engineering, but Gauss regarded it only as a tool, a means to more precise measurement. He never sought to patent it or profit from it. Such things were beneath him. His passion was not invention but understanding. He wanted to know why the universe behaved as it did, not merely how to manipulate it. As the 1850s began, the weight of years settled on him. His walks grew shorter, his calculations slower. Still, he worked every day, even when his hands ached too much to hold the pen for long. He began to catalogue his unpublished notes, a vast collection of ideas spanning geometry, number theory, astronomy, and probability. Some he labelled matura ripe, others immatura unripe. It was an act of quiet judgment, a reckoning with himself. Among those papers were insights that would not be understood until long after his death. Early formulations of non-Euclidean geometry, methods of least squares, and the mathematical groundwork for modern physics. He had, in many ways, laid the foundation for entire fields of study. But Gauss never saw it that way. When praised for his discoveries, he would shrug. "I have only cleared a path," he would say. He knew that knowledge was endless, and that even the clearest paths soon vanished into shadow. His final years passed in solitude and silence. He still visited the observatory occasionally, shuffling slowly up the worn steps. He would peer through the telescope for a few minutes, adjust a measurement, and then return home. At night, he would sit by the window and watch the stars. They had been his companions since boyhood, the one constant in a life of calculation. He had measured their positions, their movements, their distances, but now, in old age, he seemed simply to gaze. Perhaps he saw in them the ultimate expression of his faith in order, perfect, unchanging, indifferent. On February 23, 1855, Gauss awoke early, as he always did. He dressed carefully, took a light breakfast, and then lay down to rest. He told his daughter he felt unusually tired. When she returned an hour later, she found him motionless, his expression calm, as if deep in thought. His heart had stopped. He was 77 years old. In his study, the clock continued to tick. His papers lay neatly stacked, his pen resting beside a half-finished calculation. There were no last words, no grand reflections, only silence. The funeral was modest but dignified. Scholars from across Germany attended, speaking in low tones about the man who had changed the language of mathematics. His coffin was carried through the streets of Göttingen to the Albani Cemetery, where it still rests today beneath a simple stone. The inscription, chosen by his children, was brief: mathematician of the first rank. Yet those who understood his work knew that the phrase barely hinted at the scope of his genius. In the decades that followed, Gauss's ideas would echo through the centuries. His studies of curvature became the foundation of differential geometry, the language Einstein would later use to describe space-time itself. His methods of statistical analysis would shape the way scientists understood uncertainty. His electrical and magnetic theories would guide the development of telecommunication and electromagnetism. He had, in quiet solitude, measured not only the Earth but the invisible architecture of the universe. Today, when mathematicians speak of Gauss, they do so with a mix of awe and unease. His brilliance seems almost inhuman, detached, absolute, without the usual traces of weakness. Yet there is something profoundly human in his endless striving for perfection, his refusal to settle for approximation. He reminds us that the pursuit of knowledge is, at its core, an act of faith. Faith that the universe is knowable, that truth can be measured, even if never fully grasped. Gauss never found the final answers he sought, but perhaps that was never the point. Perhaps his life itself, ordered, disciplined, quietly relentless, was his answer, a testament to the beauty of precision in an imperfect world. And if, one evening, you were to stand outside the observatory in Göttingen, where the stones are worn smooth by centuries of footsteps, you might still feel it. The faint echo of numbers being written by candlelight, the soft scratch of a pen tracing infinity, and the quiet certainty that somewhere, even now, the universe is being measured. The story begins not in a factory but in a home. It is a damp spring morning in Lancashire around the year 1765. The sun has not yet risen, but smoke already rises from the chimneys of cottages scattered across the low, grey hills. Inside one such cottage, small 2 rooms, thatched roof sagging slightly under years of rain, a man sits at his loom. His name could be Thomas or Samuel or Henry, it hardly matters. He is a handloom weaver, one of tens of thousands across England's northern counties. To the world beyond his village, he is invisible, yet without him, there would be no cloth for the coats of merchants, no sailcloth for the ships that carry British goods to distant ports, no linen for the tables of the wealthy. He works by the small light of a tallow candle, the flame flickering against the wooden beams. His hands move steadily, almost without thought, shuttle to the left, shuttle to the right, the rhythmic thud of the beater pressing the threads tight. The loom creaks softly, its parts worn smooth by years of use. The work is slow. 1 yard of fine linen may take him an entire day. His wife, Mary, sits nearby, winding bobbins and spinning flax into thread. Their eldest daughter stirs the morning porridge over the hearth, and their youngest sleeps in a basket by her feet. This was how England's first industrial revolution began, not with smoke and steam, but with families like this one, working quietly in the half-light. In the mid-18th century, weaving was a domestic craft. The cottage industry, as it would later be called, depended on the coordination of entire families. A single weaver could not keep up with the demand for thread, so wives and daughters spun from dawn until dusk, using spinning wheels of various types, the great wheel for wool, the smaller Saxony wheel for flax or cotton. Spinning and weaving were part of a delicate economic ecosystem that linked rural households to merchants in nearby towns. These merchants, called putters out, supplied raw materials to spinners and weavers, then collected the finished cloth for sale at local markets or export through ports like Liverpool and Bristol. The system was old, deeply rooted in English society. It allowed workers to remain independent, setting their own hours, balancing fieldwork with loom work. For many, it offered modest comfort. enough to pay rent, buy tea, and perhaps a bit of sugar or tobacco, small luxuries of a growing global trade. But beneath this slow rhythm, change was gathering. The 1760s were years of invention. Across England, curious mechanics and restless thinkers were tinkering with machines that promised to make work faster, cheaper, and, as they said, more efficient. In 1733, John Kay, a Lancashire inventor, had patented the flying shuttle, a simple device that allowed one weaver to produce much wider cloth than before. It was a small improvement, but it doubled productivity, and for a brief time, profits. Yet progress has a way of unbalancing things. The faster looms wove, the more thread they required. Soon, the spinners could no longer keep up. Yarn prices rose, weavers complained. Merchants began to favour inventors who promised mechanical solutions. In 1764, in a cottage near Blackburn, a weaver named James Hargreaves built a curious contraption, a spinning frame that could spin 8 threads at once. His neighbours called it the spinning jenny. Within a few years, dozens of jennies appeared across Lancashire. Spinners could now produce in a day what once took a week. To merchants, it was miraculous. To hand spinners, it was a threat. Riots followed. In 1768, angry mobs broke into Hargreaves's house and smashed his machines. He fled to Nottingham, but the idea could not be destroyed. Progress, once begun, rarely retreats. For the handloom weaver in his cottage, the world changed slowly at first. He might have heard rumours from travellers of spinning engines that never tired, of mills rising near the rivers, their windows glowing late into the night. But in his own village, life continued much as before. The seasons still governed the rhythm of work. In spring and summer, he might tend a small plot of land, growing oats or potatoes. In autumn and winter, when the fields lay bare, he would weave. Each week, he carried his finished cloth to the nearest market town, perhaps Preston or Blackburn, walking miles with a roll of linen slung over his shoulder. There, in crowded market halls, he met the merchant who supplied his flax and took his goods. The prices were negotiated by weight and quality, often with little mercy. A skilled weaver could earn perhaps 8 to 10 shillings a week, enough to survive, but only just. A poor harvest or a drop in prices could ruin a family, and yet there was pride in the work. The weaver's cloth bore his signature pattern, the mark of his hands. No two pieces were quite alike. He was not rich, but he was free, master of his time, his tools, and his skill. That quiet independence was soon to vanish. The next wave of invention came swiftly. Richard Arkwright's waterframe in 1769, Samuel Crompton's spinning mule in 1779, Edmund Cartwright's power loom in 1785. Each step increased speed and scale, and with each the balance between home and factory shifted. The great mills of Lancashire began to rise, massive, windowed buildings of brick and stone powered by water wheels and later by steam. Inside, hundreds of looms clattered in unison, driven by belts and shafts that filled the air with the constant hum of motion. For the first time, production was centralized. The merchant no longer needed to travel from cottage to cottage. The workers came to him. To many handloom weavers, the sight of those mills was unsettling. Some believed they were temporary, that fine cloth would always require human skill. Others saw them as the end of their trade. They were both right. At first, the machines produced coarse fabrics, useful for sacks and uniforms, but inferior to the fine linen woven by hand. But as the technology improved, the difference faded. By the early 1800s, machine, woven cloth had become not only faster but cheaper. The cottage weavers could not compete. Imagine now our weaver in his small house in 1790. He is older, his hair grey, his fingers stiff. The sound of his loom, once common in every home along the lane, is now rare. Many of his neighbours have gone to work in the new mills. Others have left altogether, seeking labour in towns like Manchester, where wages are low but steady. He resists for as long as he can. He works longer hours, lowers his prices, tries to match the speed of the machines. But the market does not forgive. The merchants offer him less and less each month. His children, drawn by the promise of regular pay, find work in the mills. His wife's spinning wheel stands silent in the corner, replaced by cotton thread bought from the factory. The independence that once defined their life fades into dependence, on wages, on schedules, on the unseen logic of the industrial economy. At night, when the village is quiet, he still weaves by candlelight. The steady rhythm of the shuttle is comforting, even as the world beyond his door accelerates. He cannot stop weaving. It is all he knows. Meanwhile, across England, entire communities were undergoing the same transformation. The domestic looms that once filled cottages were dismantled, their parts sold for scrap or firewood. The new generation grew up under the discipline of factory bells instead of church bells. Time itself was being measured differently. In the cottage, time had been fluid, shaped by the light, the weather, and the pace of the worker. In the factory, time became mechanical. The whistle marked the start of labor, the clock marked its end. Minutes were counted, recorded, paid for. This shift, from human to mechanical time, was as profound as any technological change. It altered how people thought about work, value, and even their own bodies. The weaver who once worked with patience now labored with urgency. Productivity replaced craftsmanship. The world had entered an age where movement mattered more than meaning. Still, the transition was not complete. Well into the early 19th century, handloom weavers continued to produce fine linen, especially for luxury markets. Their skills remained unmatched in quality, though no longer in profitability. Some became specialists producing delicate lace or patterned damasks. Others turned to teaching apprentices. A few, bitter but dignified, refused to set foot in a mill, preferring poverty to the loss of independence. They lived as relics of a slower age, symbols of a craft that had built an empire and was now being consumed by it. The British Empire, after all, needed cloth. It clothed its soldiers, dressed its colonists, filled its ships with bales of cotton bound for India and the Caribbean. The very fabric that had once been woven in quiet cottages now stretched across the globe, binding continents through trade, labor, and conquest. And at the root of it all, beneath the statistics and the smoke, lay the humble loom, and the hands that once guided it. As the century turned, one could walk through Lancashire and still hear, faintly, the sound of looms in isolated homes. Slow, irregular, stubbornly human. But their days were numbered. The Industrial Revolution was not a single event, but a long, uneven tide. It did not arrive everywhere at once. It crept quietly through valleys and along rivers until even the most remote cottages felt its pull. And so the weaver's world, built on patience, skill, and the steady rhythm of thread, began to unravel. The machines had arrived, the mills had grown, the empire demanded speed, but still, one question lingered, one that even the inventors could not answer. What happens to a world when its work becomes faster than its people? It begins with a river. The River Irwell, the Ribble, the Roch. Their names ripple through the green valleys of Lancashire, feeding both the land and the people who live beside them. For centuries, they turned small water wheels that ground corn or sawed timber, but in the last decades of the 18th century, those same rivers began to power something new: cotton mills. The first mills were not yet the monstrous factories that would come later. They were modest, almost innocent, 3 or 4 stories tall, made of brick or stone, their windows small and square, their wheels creaking steadily in the current. But to the handloom weavers who had long relied on those rivers for life, the mills were a sign of intrusion. The sound of the water, once the quiet background to village life, now carried the harsh rhythm of iron and timber gears. Inside, the air was thick with lint and dust. The constant hum of machines filled the rooms, mingling with the hiss of steam and the faint cries of children who worked the spinning frames. The new machines, Arkwright's water frames, Hargraves's jennies, Crompton's spinning mules, had multiplied the output of cloth beyond anything the old cottage system could imagine. Where one spinner once produced enough thread for a few weavers, now a single mill supplied hundreds. And as spinning became mechanized, weaving would soon follow. The transformation was not merely technological, it was social, moral, and deeply personal. In the 1770s and 1780s, rural families faced a choice that was no choice at all. The merchants who had once brought them flax and cotton began to withdraw their contracts. Why pay a dozen weavers when one machine could do the work? Some tried to hold on, weaving finer linen or specializing in rare patterns. Others gave up their looms entirely, taking labor in the mills. The migration to the factory towns began. Villages that had been quiet for generations suddenly emptied. Families packed their few belongings, a loom, a chest, a spinning wheel, some crockery, and set off toward the promise of regular pay. They walked the rough roads to Manchester, Bolton, Oldham, or Blackburn, joining the growing ranks of the industrial poor. The journey was short in miles, but immense in consequence. Manchester in 1790 was a place of contradictions. By day, its streets echoed with the rumble of carts carrying bales of cotton. By night, its windows glowed with lamplight reflected off wet cobblestones. The air was thick, a mixture of smoke, damp, and the sharp scent of oil. It was called Cottonopolis, the city of cotton, though it was not yet beautiful, nor yet truly urban. The mills stood beside fields and rivers, their tall chimneys venting black smoke into grey skies. Rows of new terraced houses spread outward from the town centres, built hastily to house the workers who poured in from the countryside. Life in these new industrial communities was unlike anything the old rural world had known. A weaver who once set his own hours now rose and slept by the factory bell. His wages were steady but small. His wife and children, if strong enough, might join him in the mill. There, they stood for 12 or 14 hours a day, tending the spinning frames, tying broken threads or cleaning lint from the floor. There were rules for everything: when to eat, when to rest, when to speak. A fine might be deducted for lateness, a mistake, or even for talking too much. Yet, for all the hardship, the mills offered something powerful: certainty. Back in the countryside, those who remained at their looms faced an invisible enemy: price. The rapid expansion of mechanized production flooded the market with cheap cloth. Cotton, once a luxury, became common. Prices for hand-woven linen and wool dropped steadily. Merchants, sensing profit, pressed the weavers harder. Contracts were cut, payments delayed. The cottage industry, once the backbone of England's textile trade, began to collapse. Between 1790 and 1820, the number of handloom weavers in Lancashire fell dramatically. Those who remained found their income halved. A skilled weaver might earn 20 shillings a week in 1790. By 1810 it was 7 or 8. By 1820 many were earning less than 5, barely enough to survive. This economic decline had consequences that rippled through society. Hunger spread. Cottages fell into disrepair. Weavers pawned their tools and furniture to buy food. In towns like Blackburn and Burnley, riots erupted. They were small, desperate acts: the breaking of machines, the burning of mills. But they echoed a deep truth. The people who had once been the creators of cloth were now its casualties. The government, watching from London, saw both progress and peril. Industrialization was feeding Britain's growing empire. The mills exported vast quantities of cloth to India, Africa, and the Americas, fueling global trade and enriching merchants. But it was also creating a new class of workers: poor, overworked, increasingly restless. Reports began to appear in newspapers and parliamentary inquiries. They described the conditions inside the mills: the deafening noise, the dangerous machines, the child labor. Children as young as 6 or 7 worked as scavengers, crawling under moving looms to collect waste cotton. Accidents were common. In 1802, the first Factory Act was passed, a small, tentative law that limited child labor to 12 hours a day and required factory owners to provide ventilation and basic education. It was, in practice, often ignored, but it marked a beginning. Society was learning that progress came at a price. Among the weavers themselves, a different kind of resistance took shape: quiet, stubborn, rooted in craft and pride. Some weavers refused to leave their cottages, even as poverty deepened. They saw themselves as the last guardians of a disappearing skill. Their hands knew things no machine could imitate: the delicate tension of linen, the subtle shift of weight in the shuttle, the faint music of the loom's rhythm. One traveller, writing in 1818, described visiting a cottage in Lancashire where an old man still wove by hand. He worked slowly, as if each thread were a memory. The loom seemed part of him. Around him hung cloths of remarkable beauty, though he told me they were worthless now. He said, "They call me stubborn, but I say, the machine cannot dream." His words may never have been recorded in any official history, but they captured something larger: the human cost of mechanization. The machine, after all, could not dream. It could only repeat. The social fabric of Lancashire changed alongside its cloth. Entire generations grew up without memory of the old cottage system. Children born in mill towns never saw the fields their grandparents once tended. Their lives were bounded by walls, their hours ruled by whistles. A new rhythm had replaced the old. Church bells, which once marked the passage of the day, were drowned out by the hum of machinery. The sound of looms, thousands of them, all in motion, became the voice of progress. Travellers described the towns as living engines, breathing steam and cotton dust. And yet in the evenings, when the machines finally stopped and the mills went dark, the workers poured into the narrow streets, tired, coughing, their clothes white with lint. They returned to their homes, small and close, their windows dimly lit by candles. There, some would sit by a fire and recall the quiet rhythm of the old cottage loom, the steady, patient sound that once filled their fathers' homes. Progress had not erased memory, only buried it beneath the weight of industry. By 1820, the transformation was complete. The cottage industry had given way to the factory system. Lancashire had become the beating heart of the world's textile trade, its products reaching from London to Calcutta to the Caribbean. The British Empire itself was clothed in Lancashire cotton. The irony was cruel. The raw cotton that fed the mills often came from the labour of enslaved people in the American South. The finished cloth, in turn, was exported to colonies where it disrupted local economies and traditions of textile making. The same machines that had replaced the English weaver now displaced Indian spinners and artisans, whose livelihoods had endured for centuries. In this way, the story of the Lancashire weaver was not only a local tragedy but a global one, a quiet revolution that restructured the world's balance of labor, wealth, and power. The linen threads of empire stretched far, binding the fates of people who would never meet. For those who still clung to their looms, hope came in flickers. A few small workshops survived by producing specialty goods, fine muslins, patterned silks, or household linens for the upper classes. But these were exceptions, not salvation. The weaver's craft, once a proud symbol of English skill, had become an anachronism. And yet, even as machines took over, even as time itself was measured in the rhythm of gears, the loom remained a potent symbol. It appeared in poetry, in art, in the dreams of reformers who longed for return to a simpler, more human form of labor. The weaver had become, in a sense, the conscience of the Industrial Revolution, a reminder of what had been lost in the pursuit of progress. In 1826, a final wave of despair swept through the weavers of Lancashire. Faced with starvation wages and rising prices, thousands joined together in protest. They marched through towns and villages, breaking machines demanding justice. The army was called in, dozens were arrested, the rebellion failed, the mills went on, but their voices, quiet, desperate, human, echoed through the next century, shaping the labor movements that would eventually fight for shorter hours, fair wages, and safer conditions. The story of the handloom weaver did not end with his death. It lived on in every worker who demanded dignity in an industrial age. By the time Queen Victoria came to the throne in 1837, the old weaver's cottage was a relic. Tourists sometimes visited them, marveling at the ancient looms still standing in darkened rooms, draped with unfinished cloth. The last weavers, often elderly and poor, became curiosities, living witnesses to a vanished world. Their lives had been ordinary, their work repetitive, their existence largely forgotten by history. Yet, in their slow labor, they had woven the very foundation of the modern world. Without them there would be no factories, no empire, no modern economy. Their story, quiet, steady, and almost painfully human, was the story of transformation itself. Still, one cannot help but wonder, when the weaver's hands finally stilled, and the machines took over completely, did the world gain more than it lost? Or did the hum of progress drown out something essential? The year is 1842. In a damp cottage on the edge of Burnley, a man named Joseph Hardman sits before an old wooden loom. It is worn smooth by decades of use, the beams scarred with knife marks where threads were once cut and tied. The air smells of dust and flax oil. Outside, the mills thunder day and night. But inside this room, time moves differently. Joseph is one of the last of his kind, a handloom weaver. He is 60, his hair thin and grey, his eyes strained by candlelight. The loom before him creaks with each pull of the beater. His movements are slow, careful. The shuttle slides from one side to the other, carrying a thread of linen that gleams faintly in the flickering light. In the next room, his wife tends a small fire, boiling a pot of potatoes. Their children are grown now. One works as a spinner in the nearby mill, another as a labourer on the canal. Joseph has refused factory work all his life. He says the machines are too loud, too fast, too inhuman. Let the iron men do their weaving, he mutters. I'll keep mine in wood. The world beyond Joseph's cottage has changed beyond recognition. Lancashire is no longer a landscape of fields and cottages, but of mills and smoke. From Manchester to Blackburn, rows of tall chimneys pierce the sky. Trains cut through valleys that once echoed only with the sound of sheep. The canals, once the lifeblood of rural trade, now carry coal and cotton to the cities. In 1842 alone, Britain exported over 2,000 million yards of cotton cloth, an unimaginable quantity, woven by machines that never tired, powered by coal dug from the north of England. To the statesmen and industrialists of the age, this was triumph. The British Empire clothed half the world. Factories produced not only textiles but wealth, power, and influence. The nation that had once relied on humble cottage weavers now ruled global commerce. But for the men like Joseph, who still clung to the loom, progress felt like extinction. Handloom weaving had become a profession of ghosts. There were still thousands of weavers scattered across Lancashire and Yorkshire in the 1840s, but their numbers dwindled each year. They were no longer independent craftsmen but relics, poor, often ill, living on the margins of industrial towns. Parliamentary reports from the time described their condition in painful detail. Investigators sent by the government found families living in single-room cottages. weaving coarse cloth for a few pence a yard. In some cases, weavers earned less than a shilling a day. Their cottages were cold, their food meager. One report published in 1840 recorded a weaver's words, "Me eat when we can, sir. Bread and tea, sometimes potatoes. The children go barefoot. The loom keeps me busy, but it doesn't keep us fed." These were not lazy men. They worked from dawn to dusk, driven by habit and pride rather than profit. The rhythm of the loom gave them purpose, even as it failed to provide sustenance. The old songs of the weavers, once sung in taverns and fairs, turned to laments. "Oh, dear me, the world is ill, divided, them that work the hardest are the least provided." Still, there was something stubbornly dignified in their decline. For centuries, the hand loom had been the heart of English domestic life. It had taught discipline, patience, and skill. Families had been built around it. Fathers weaving, mothers spinning, children winding bobbins. It had provided not just cloth but identity. Now, as the machines roared, that identity lingered like a fading echo. Some reformers began to take notice. Writers like Elizabeth Gaskell and Friedrich Engels visited the mill towns and described the conditions of the workers with compassion and alarm. Gaskell's Mary Barton, 1848, painted the life of the Manchester poor in stark, human detail, giving voice to those who had long been invisible. Engels's condition of the working class in England, 1845, was more severe, an indictment of industrial capitalism itself. Both writers, in their own ways, preserved the memory of men like Joseph. They recognized that the Industrial Revolution was not only a story of machines and progress, but of lives quietly consumed by it. By mid-century, even the mills themselves began to change. Steam power replaced water. The great cotton factories grew taller, louder, more efficient. The clatter of looms became the background music of the modern age. Children who once learned spinning at home were now trained in factory schools. Women who had once worked alongside their husbands in cottages became wage earners in vast weaving sheds. The rhythm of life, once intimate and domestic, became public and mechanical. In many ways, the mills became the new homes of the working class. They offered security of a sort, wages, community, routine, but they also imposed discipline, a discipline that shaped not just how people worked, but how they thought. Time was no longer a natural rhythm, it was a measured quantity. The weaver, once a craftsman, had become a cog, and yet even as this transformation took hold, the handloom lingered. Travellers through Lancashire in the 1850s still reported finding old men at their looms, often working for pleasure rather than profit. Some wove coarse sacking or cheap calico to sell in local markets, others simply wove to keep their hands busy. The sound of a single loom, slow, uneven, human, could still be heard beneath the roar of the mills. In some ways it was a sound of resistance. The loom had become an act of remembrance, a small defiance against the total triumph of the machine. Meanwhile, the empire that Lancashire cloth had helped build was reaching its height. British textiles dominated markets across the world. In India, traditional weavers, once masters of fine muslin and silk, were driven into poverty by the flood of cheap factory cloth. In Africa, British cotton was traded for human lives in the waning years of the slave trade. In the Americas, plantation-grown cotton fueled the very machines that enslaved others. The threads of empire were strong, but they were tangled. Each yard of cloth woven in Lancashire carried with it the labour of thousands spinners in Manchester, sailors in Liverpool, slaves in Alabama, and mill workers in Bombay. The old English weaver, working quietly in his cottage, could not have imagined the vast, invisible network his trade had become. His simple craft had been transformed into the engine of global capitalism. And yet, for all its reach, something essential had been lost. A sense of proportion, of intimacy, of humanity. The loom had once connected families to their neighbours, villages to local markets. Now, it connected nations, but through profit, not people. In 1860, the cotton famine struck. The American Civil War disrupted supplies of raw cotton to Britain, and the mills of Lancashire fell silent. For a brief moment, history turned back upon itself. Thousands of factory workers were thrown out of work. The streets of Manchester and Bolton filled with unemployed spinners and weavers. Local charities distributed food and clothing, and in the countryside, some families returned to the handloom, if only out of desperation. The sound of the old wooden shuttles returned, faint, irregular, but unmistakable. It was not a revival, but a remembrance, a return to the rhythms of the past where machines went hungry for lack of cotton. For 2 years, the looms in the cottages clattered once more. Then, as the war ended and trade resumed, the mills revived, and the handlooms fell silent for the last time. By the turn of the century, the handloom had become an artifact, Museums began collecting them, along with spinning wheels, bobbins, and samples of linen woven by hand. In the industrial towns, the last weavers were remembered as curiosities, living links to a vanished world. Photographs from the 1890s show old men and women sitting beside their looms, faces lined, hands folded, the tools of their craft preserved around them like relics of a lost religion. They are not smiling, but neither do they seem bitter. There is a calm resignation in their expressions, as if they had long accepted that their work, though forgotten, had meaning, and indeed it did. For beneath the smoke and machinery of the Industrial Revolution, the quiet labor of the weavers had built the foundation upon which the modern world stood. Their patience, their precision, their endurance. These were the qualities that made mass production possible, even if the machines that followed no longer required the human hand. The last handloom weaver of Lancashire died sometime in the early 1900s. No one recorded his name. Perhaps he was a man like Joseph Hardman, who wove until his eyes failed and his hands could no longer grip the shuttle. When he died, the loom likely stood silent in his cottage until someone came to take it apart. The wood, seasoned by years of use, may have been burned for warmth. The cloth left unfinished. The sound of his last shuttle, a soft, hollow tap, fading into memory. The mills continued for another century, but even they too would fall silent one by one as industry moved elsewhere. By the late 20th century, the great weaving sheds of Lancashire were empty, their walls echoing with the ghosts of machines. Today only fragments remain, a few preserved looms, some cloth samples, the names of inventors carved into history. But if you walk through the valleys of Lancashire on a quiet day, you might still hear it, the faint, imagined sound of a shuttle sliding through the threads, a memory of the hands that once wove the world together. The linen threads of empire are gone now, frayed, forgotten, scattered across time. But the story they tell remains essential, that every great machine begins in the patience of a human hand, and every empire, no matter how vast, is built on the quiet work of ordinary lives. And perhaps, if there is a lesson in all of this, it is not about progress or decline, but about rhythm, the balance between speed and stillness, between making and meaning. For the world moves quickly now, faster than any loom, faster than any hand, but somewhere deep beneath the hum of modern life, that old rhythm still beats, slow, steady, and human. In the half-light of dawn, the forge comes alive. A low, rhythmic thud shakes the earth, iron striking iron. The sound rolls through the valley like thunder, mingling with the hiss of steam and the smell of burning coal. Sparks leap and fall, glowing briefly before vanishing into the soot-covered floor. The blacksmith wipes his brow with the back of his arm. His name is Elias Cartwright, and for 40 years he has worked this forge on the edge of Sheffield. The place is cramped, dark, and hot, but to Elias it is a chapel. The anvil is his altar, the hammer his prayer. He shapes the world one strike at a time. Today the work is urgent. A wagon wheel has split, a ploughshare is cracked, and in a corner a rough casting waits, a gear newly delivered from the foundry. It is not his work, and he does not trust it. The metal looks strange, pale, brittle, made by men who no longer swing hammers but tend furnaces. Cast iron, he mutters, spitting on the floor. Too easy to pour, too easy to break. He will mend it though. That's his craft. Elias belongs to the last generation of true smiths, men who learned their trade from fathers and grandfathers, who shaped iron by feel and instinct. In his youth, Sheffield was still a town of forges and workshops, not yet the great industrial city it would become. The old ways were slow, but they were sure. Every hinge, nail, and blade passed through human hands. The blacksmith knew his neighbors, his tools, his metal. The fire spoke to him in color and sound, orange for soft, white for ready, blue for brittle. He was not rich, but he was respected. A village without a smith was a body without a heart. But the 1780s brought a new kind of fire. In the hills beyond the town, men were digging not for ore but for coal. The furnaces of the new foundries blazed day and night, their smoke drifting for miles. The air itself seemed to darken, thick with ash and ambition. The ironmasters had arrived. Men like John Wilkinson, the so-called Iron-mad Wilkinson, who built steam engines for Boulton and Watt, and Henry Court, who developed the puddling furnace that could refine pig iron on a massive scale. Their furnaces roared like beasts, swallowing coal and spitting out molten metal by the ton. And with them came a new faith, not in muscle or craft, but in machinery. To a man like Elias, it felt like blasphemy. He visited one of the new foundries once just to see it. The heat hit him before he even entered, a wave of dry, choking air inside. The roar was deafening. Huge vats of molten iron glowed like captured suns. Men in suit, black coats moved through the firelight, their faces half hidden behind masks of ash. Chains creaked overhead, sparks fell like rain. The floor trembled with the weight of industry. He watched as molten metal poured from a crucible into a mold. Not struck, not shaped, but poured like soup into a bowl. The whole process felt mechanical, soulless. Quicker, cheaper, stronger. One of the overseers told him proudly, "The way of the future." Elias only nodded. But when he left, he walked slowly and did not look back. The world had changed before his eyes. The invention of the steam engine, first perfected by James Watt in the 1770s, had turned iron from a craft into a necessity. Engines needed cylinders, pistons, boilers, all made of metal. The railways that followed needed tracks and locomotives. Ships demanded anchors, propellers, chains. Iron was no longer a tool. It was the body of civilization itself. And Sheffield was becoming its beating heart. By 1800, the town's valleys were lined with foundries and forges, their fires glowing through the night. The rivers that had once powered water wheels now ran black with soot. The old-hand smiths were drawn into the factories or left behind entirely. Elias refused to go. He worked alone, as his father had done, repairing plows, hinges, and horseshoes. But the orders grew fewer. Farmers bought factory-made tools, merchants sold imported steel. The forge that had once rung from morning till dusk now stood cold for days at a time. Still, he lit it every dawn. Habit, duty, faith. There was a boy who sometimes visited him, Thomas, the miller's son. Thin, curious, no more than 12. He loved to watch Elias work, fascinated by the dance of sparks and the glow of metal. "Will you teach me?" he asked once. Elias smiled, tired but kind. "If you've got patience and a strong arm." Thomas nodded eagerly. But a week later, his father found him a place at the rolling mill. Better wages, shorter learning, no waiting for apprenticeships. When Elias heard, he said nothing, only sighed, another thread cut. By 1820, the change was complete. Sheffield had become the city of steel. Iron rails crisscrossed the countryside. The first locomotives screamed across the land, their wheels striking sparks on the tracks. Foundries grew into vast complexes, employing hundreds. The hammer, once the emblem of strength and skill, was now mechanical, powered by steam. The anvil, once the center of every village, had been replaced by rolling mills and steam hammers. Even the cathedral of the city seemed built not of stone, but of iron and fire. Visitors compared the great foundries to temples, their chimneys rising like spires, their furnaces glowing like stained glass at dusk. The workers, blackened by soot, moved through the light like priests of a new order, the order of industry. To the poets and reformers of the time, this was both wonder and warning. William Blake, wandering the industrial cities, called them dark satanic mills. Others saw in them the proof of progress, the triumph of human reason over nature. But to Elias, who watched from his small forge on the edge of town, it felt like exile. He had not left his craft. The world had left him. On a winter night in 1829, a stranger came to his forge. A young engineer, thin and pale, carrying a rolled drawing under his arm. "I've heard you're the best with wrought iron," the man said. "I need a coupling forged, strong enough to hold an engine together." Elias studied the drawing. Complex curves, threaded bolts, measurements finer than the width of a hair. It was unlike anything he had ever seen. "I can make it," he said slowly, "but I'll not rush it." The man nodded. "Take your time. It's for a railway engine." Elias smiled faintly. Everything is, these days. He worked through the night. The forge glowed red against the snow outside. Each strike of the hammer rang clear and sharp, echoing off the stone walls like a hymn. When he quenched the iron at last, the hiss filled the air like a sigh. He handed the finished piece to the engineer with quiet pride. "It'll hold," he said, "so long as men do." That was his last great work. A year later, Elias's forge closed. His tools were sold, his anvil rusted in the yard. He moved into the city, where his daughter kept a small shop. Sometimes he walked past the foundries and listened to the thunder of the great hammers. He said it comforted him, strangely, that the sound was familiar, even if the hands had changed. When he died in 1833, his coffin was carried past one of the new ironworks. The men there stopped their hammers for a minute, in respect for old Cartwright, the smith. The silence that followed was the truest tribute they could give. The fire he tended did not die, of course. It spread. Within a generation, the forgers of Sheffield and Birmingham had built bridges across the world. The iron made by men like Elias became rails in India, ships in the Pacific, engines in Africa. Iron, once the humble servant of the plough, became the master material of empires. But beneath that triumph lies a story like Elias's, quiet, human, and enduring, of craft giving way to industry, of hands replaced by machines, and of a man who kept the old fire burning, even as the world turned to steel. The year is 1831, and the earth trembles beneath iron wheels. In a wide field near the English town of Darlington, hundreds of spectators gather in the cold morning air. Some have walked for miles, others have ridden in carriages, eager to witness the new marvel everyone is whispering about. George Stephenson's locomotive, the Rocket. It is smaller than most imagined, a black cylinder on spindly wheels, smoke puffing from its chimney like the breath of a great beast. But when the whistle blows and the engine lurches forward, the crowd gasps. It moves with impossible strength and speed, a shriek of steam echoing over the hills. Iron on iron. The Industrial Revolution has found its voice. By the 1830s, the transformation of Britain's iron industry was complete. The forges that once shaped tools and horseshoes now built locomotives, rails, boilers, and bridges. The steam engine, once a curiosity, had become the heart of industry, pumping water from mines, driving mills, and propelling ships. The old rhythm of hammer and anvil gave way to the deep, mechanical beat of pistons and flywheels. The foundries of the north, in Sheffield, Birmingham, and Manchester, glowed night and day, their chimneys coughing smoke into the low grey sky. Inside, the work never stopped. Men laboured in 12-hour shifts, their faces blackened by soot, their lungs filled with dust. The air shimmered with heat, the clang of metal unceasing. There were few windows, little light beyond the molten glow of iron. And yet, for all its hardship, there was pride in the iron itself. At the great Dowlais Ironworks in South Wales, the furnaces burned so hot that visitors described the night sky as living fire. The work stretched for miles, blast furnaces, rolling mills, foundries, and workshops, employing thousands. Men, women, and even children worked together in the heat. The wages were poor, the danger constant, but the sense of belonging to something vast and powerful was undeniable. A foreman there, interviewed in 1841, said simply, "Mum make the bones of the world." And he was right. The iron made in places like Dowlais and Sheffield built the railways that bound Britain together. It became the ribs of bridges like the Menai Suspension Bridge, the hulls of ships that sailed to India and China, the beams that supported the great factories of Manchester. The world was being remade, and iron was its skeleton. For men like Thomas Cartwright, grandson of the old blacksmith Elias, the forge was no longer a small shop but a roaring inferno of machinery. Thomas had not learned the trade from his grandfather's anvil, but from the engineers of the foundry floor. He worked at a great works outside Sheffield, where the new Bessemer converters turned molten iron into steel in a matter of minutes, a process so fast and violent that it seemed almost alive. The first time Thomas saw it, he could not look away. A great pier-shaped vessel tilted forward, pouring a stream of liquid fire. The roar was deafening, the light blinding. Sparks shot into the air like stars. The workers stood at a distance, faces wrapped in scarves, eyes narrowed against the glare. As the air blasted through the molten metal, impurities burned away. The iron brightened, whitened, screamed. When it was done, what remained was something new, steel, pure and strong. It was a miracle of chemistry and heat. The invention of Henry Bessemer's converter in 1856 changed everything. Until then, steel was rare and expensive, used mainly for tools and weapons. Bessemer's process made it cheap and abundant. Suddenly, steel could be used for everything: rails, bridges, ships, buildings. The world entered what some called the Age of Iron, though steel was its true master. With steel came new dreams of scale. Engineers began to imagine structures that had once seemed impossible. Bridges that spanned entire valleys, ships that crossed oceans without sails, buildings that scraped the sky. In 1851, the Crystal Palace rose in Hyde Park, a vast structure of glass and iron, built to house the Great Exhibition. More than 14,000 exhibitors from across the empire displayed their goods beneath its glittering arches. The building itself became the star of the show. Visitors compared it to a cathedral made of air and light. The poet Tennyson called it the fair dream of glass and iron. To others, it was proof that man had finally conquered matter. Yet not all felt triumphant. The workers who built the engines and girders lived in crowded slums, their wages barely enough to feed a family. The soot that drifted from the foundries coated the streets, the windows, even the bread sold in the markets. Children played under skies the colour of ash. The same iron that built prosperity also chained men to labour. In Sheffield, the grinders, men who sharpened steel tools on great stone wheels, often died young from Grender's disease, a form of silicosis caused by inhaling fine dust. Their lungs turned grey, their breath came shallow. In the ironworks, accidents were common: burns, crushed limbs, explosions. A single misstep near a converter could mean death, but replacements were always waiting at the gate. The factory whistle ruled their lives, beginning and ending each day with its shrill command. The rhythm of the machine had become the rhythm of existence. Still, there was a strange beauty in it all. Travelers by train, itself a miracle of iron and steam, wrote of passing through industrial towns at night, watching the furnaces flare and fade in the darkness. The horizon glowed red, as though the world were on fire. Some called it hellish, others divine. One visitor from France, the historian Alexis de Tocqueville, described a foundry at work. 1,000 furnaces blaze. The earth trembles, the air vibrates with the clang of hammers. The men move like shadows among the fires, giants in a land of flame. The industrial north had become a new kind of landscape. Not pastoral, not wild, but mechanical. A man-made wilderness of smoke, iron and noise. Meanwhile, engineers pushed the limits further. Isambard Kingdom Brunel, the brilliant and restless builder, designed iron ships like the SS Great Britain and the SS Great Eastern, marvels of the age. His railways cut through mountains and crossed marshes. His bridges, like the Clifton Suspension Bridge, seemed to float between heaven and earth. Everywhere, iron was the key. Brunel once said, "The age of small things is past." He was right. Everything was bigger now: the engines, the ships, the ambitions. And yet, for all its progress, something of the human scale was lost. The blacksmith's intimacy with his work, the rhythm of hand and hammer, these were swallowed by the noise of industry. Thomas Cartwright, walking home from his shift, sometimes thought of his grandfather's small forge on the edge of town. The quiet, the smell of coal, the steady ring of a single hammer. He had traded that silence for progress. But sometimes, in the roar of the foundry, he could almost hear the old rhythms still, faint, beneath the engines. By 1870, Britain's iron and steel industries were the envy of the world. Railways spanned continents, telegraph cables crossed oceans, ships of iron ruled the seas. The empire itself seemed built from metal, an unyielding machine, efficient and vast. But cracks were forming even then. Other nations were rising: America, Germany, France, building their own foundries, learning from Britain's example. The global furnace had been lit, and it would never go out. At home, labor unrest began to stir. Workers demanded shorter hours, safer conditions, fair pay. The same hands that built the age of iron now clenched into fists of protest. And beneath the smoke and triumph, a quiet question echoed, one that Elias Cartwright might have asked half a century before. Was the fire still serving man, or had man begun to serve the fire? The engines still thundered, the furnaces still burned, the night sky still glowed red. But somewhere, deep in the heart of every foundry, there lingered a faint uncertainty, a flicker of something both proud and uneasy. Progress had a sound, and it was beautiful. But it was also very, very loud. The smoke no longer rises as thickly as it once did. The chimneys still stand, but some have gone cold. It is the late 19th century, and the great furnaces of Britain, those roaring cathedrals of iron, are beginning to grow quiet. The industrial north, once a blazing engine of progress, feels the first chill of stillness. It is not collapse, not yet, but something in the rhythm has changed. The world is moving faster, and in directions few expected. When Thomas Cartwright's son, Edward, takes over his father's post at the steelworks in 1875, he finds a world both familiar and transformed. The great foundry still glows at night, but the air feels different. The optimism that once filled the workshops, the belief that iron could build paradise, has begun to tarnish. Machines now make machines. Steam engines drive mechanical hammers larger than houses. Conveyor belts carry pig iron from furnace to forge. The men who once handled molten metal directly are now operators, attendants to the machine. The fire has been tamed, the human hand replaced. Edward is a foreman now, not a smith. He oversees 30 men in a long shed where steel plates are rolled thinner than a coin. He still carries a hammer, though he uses it only to check the resonance of the sheets. When struck correctly, the steel sings, a long, low note like the hum of a bell. He listens carefully each morning, as if the metal were trying to tell him something. The work is efficient, almost mechanical, and that, in a sense, is the problem. Across Britain, the vast ironworks and rolling mills face new competition. In Germany and the United States, younger industries are rising, equipped with newer furnaces, cheaper labor, and bolder ambition. The names change, Krupp in Essen, Carnegie in Pittsburgh, but the spirit is the same: faster, larger, stronger. And while British steel remains respected, it is no longer unrivaled. The railways that once linked the empire now carry foreign imports. Ships that once left Liverpool with British goods now return with cheaper steel from abroad. The age of empire continues, but the industrial heart begins to skip a beat. Still, for the men in the foundries, life goes on. The daily rituals remain the same: the whistle at dawn, the heat of the furnace, the meal of bread and dripping, the fatigue at dusk. The smell of coal dust never leaves their clothes. The river beside the mills still runs grey, carrying ash and slag to the sea. Children still play among the slag heaps, building castles from cinders. Women scrub soot from the windows that never quite come clean. In Sheffield, the great works line the Don River like fortresses. The sky glows faintly red at night, though the glow is thinner now. A visitor from London remarks that it looks like a city built in the belly of a volcano. But for those who live there, it is simply home. The technology continues to advance. The open hearth furnace developed by Siemens and Martin allows for more precise control of steel production. Electric arc furnaces appear in the laboratories, hinting at a future where fire itself might be replaced by current. But each innovation seems to demand fewer men. Edward notices the layoffs begin quietly, a few here, a few there. The machines are faster, the steel purer. The foremen speak of efficiency, but in the taverns after work, men mutter about being replaced by smoke and steam. The unions grow stronger, strikes erupt, first small, then larger. The great ironworks of South Wales fall silent for weeks at a time. The newspapers call it unrest. The workers call it necessity. They demand safety, wages, dignity. The same metal that built bridges is now the barrier between masters and men. By the 1880s, the iron city of Sheffield begins to show its age. Its cobbled streets are lined with blackened buildings, its canals choked with silt and waste. The air tastes of iron oxide, that faint metallic tang that never quite leaves your mouth. Yet amid the grime, beauty persists. The sunlight, when it breaks through the smoke, glitters on puddles of oil like stained glass. The red glow of a furnace at midnight looks almost holy against the dark hills. And when the great steam hammers fall, shaking the ground, it feels like the pulse of some sleeping god. There is reverence in the repetition. Even boredom takes on a kind of sacred rhythm. Edward, now grey-haired, finds comfort in that. He walks the line of furnaces each morning, nodding to the men. They respect him. A quiet, fair foreman who still believes that work has dignity. But he senses the change coming. The apprentices are fewer. The silence between shifts grows longer. Sometimes he pauses outside the foundry gates and listens, not to the hammering, but to the spaces between. In 1890, a visitor arrives, an American engineer, curious about British methods. He takes notes as Edward explains the rolling process, the treatment of steel, the careful quenching. Afterward, the visitor says, almost apologetically, "You do fine work, but it's all too careful. Too slow, we build to numbers now. We trust the math." Edward nods, polite but unmoved. He knows the math, but he also knows the sound of a plate that's cooled too fast, the subtle shift in color that tells you the steel will crack. The numbers can't hear that. When the visitor leaves, Edward wipes his hands and returns to work, comforted by the hum of his machines. But the words linger, faint and cold like a draft under a door. Too careful, too slow. The world no longer waits for craftsmanship, it wants output. In the twilight of the century, the great foundries begin to close. The smaller works vanish first, the family shops, the independent forges, then, slowly, even the giants begin to fall silent. Some are converted into warehouses. Others stand abandoned, their furnaces cold, their chimneys leaning over empty yards. In the quiet that follows, birds nest in the rafters. Rust creeps over the girders. Rain fills the pits where molten metal once glowed. The people adapt, as they always have. Some find work in new industries. Chemicals, electricity, rail maintenance. Others leave, seeking better fortunes abroad. The once mighty sound of iron gives way to the hum of machines powered by something unseen. Wires, motors and light. Fire, after all, was only the beginning. Edward dies in 1901, the same year as Queen Victoria. His passing feels symbolic, the end of an age built from iron and smoke. His sons work not in foundries but in offices, overseeing production through ledgers and telegraphs. The family name, once synonymous with the forge, now appears on letterhead rather than anvils. Progress, it seems, has outpaced memory. Yet the iron remains. The bridges, the railways, the ships, all still stand, silent witnesses to the centuries of labor that forged them. They rust slowly, but their strength endures. Travelers crossing the great bridges of the north sometimes stop and listen to the wind moving through the girders. There's a faint echo there, if you listen closely, the rhythm of hammer and anvil, the ghostly percussion of a vanished craft. And in the ruins of old foundries, The earth itself glows faintly orange when the sun sets, the last reflection of fires long gone. The 20th century dawns with electric light and motorcars, with telegraphs and telephones, with steel towers and ships of war. Iron has become invisible, part of the background of modernity. It no longer inspires awe, but in the quiet corners of old towns, the memory of the iron cathedral lingers, in soot-stained walls, in rusted tools, in the stories of families who once shaped the bones of the world. There is a strange peace in this fading, a stillness earned through centuries of noise. The fire sleeps, but it is not gone. It waits deep beneath the ground, in seams of ore and in the hands of those who still remember what it means to forge. For every age, in the end, must be rebuilt from something solid. And when that time comes again, when the world grows quiet enough to hear the sound of hammer on steel, perhaps someone will stand at a forge, light a coal, and begin once more. If you stand on the edge of the Sahara Desert just after dawn, you might believe that nothing has ever lived here. The land is flat, pale, and endless. A sea without water, its waves made of wind-blown dunes. The light cuts sharp against the horizon. Even sound seems to vanish into the air. And yet, if you wait long enough, you will hear it. A faint rhythm, almost like breathing, bells, hooves, voices carried by the wind. A caravan is coming. The salt caravans were the arteries of medieval Africa. Long trains of camels stretching for miles across the dunes, carrying slabs of salt from the mines of the desert to the kingdoms of the Sahel and beyond. To the people of the desert, salt was more precious than gold. It preserved meat and fish, replenished the body in the brutal heat, and even served as currency. A single block of salt might buy a family enough grain to last for months. And so, from the 8th century onward, the desert became alive with movement. The routes were many, from Tagaza and Taudeni in the far north through Timbuktu, Walata and Gao, down to the rich kingdoms of Mali and Songhai. Each journey was long and perilous, each crossing a negotiation between man, beast, and nature. The caravans gathered at Oses, small green miracles in the middle of the desert. At Bilma, Arawain and Tuot, the wells were deep, and the palms cast thin shadows across the sand. Traders would camp for days, repairing harnesses, counting bundles, and feeding their camels before the next stage. The animals were as vital as the salt itself. The dromedary camel, with its single hump, was perfectly adapted to the desert, wide padded feet for walking on sand, long eyelashes to block the sun, and a temperament suited to both endurance and stubbornness. Each camel could carry up to 300 pounds, enough for 3 large slabs of salt wrapped in palm fiber. A typical caravan might have hundreds of camels. The largest, recorded by Arab geographers, could number over 10,000. When they moved, they formed a living line across the dunes, slow but steady, each step measured, each bell ringing in time. The desert was not empty, it was simply vast. Across its expanse moved not only traders but also guides, scholars and pilgrims. Many of them were Berbers, the desert people who knew the routes like veins beneath the skin of the earth. Their knowledge was inherited, not written, a mental map of wells, dunes, and stars. To travel the Sahara was to trust memory in the heavens. At night, the sky was so full of stars that travelers swore the ground glowed faintly from their reflection. The pole star pointed the way north, and the arc of the Milky Way traced the great curve of the roads. If the wind erased the tracks, the stars redrew them. But for all its beauty, the desert was merciless. A single sandstorm could bury a caravan in minutes. The hot wind, the yibli, could strip skin and blind eyes. The heat at midday was so fierce that travelers sometimes marched by moonlight instead, sleeping beneath blankets during the day to escape the sun. The silence was complete, so deep that men spoke in whispers, as if afraid to disturb the air. Yet even here, in the midst of desolation, there was order. Each caravan had its own hierarchy. At the head rode the chief trader, or Amin, who negotiated prices and dealt with local rulers. Beside him rode the imguide, the camel masters who handled the animals. Behind them followed laborers, scribes, guards, and cooks. And behind all of them, the long, groaning line of camels swaying with the rhythm of eternity. The desert may have been silent, but commerce was not. When the caravan reached an oasis town, the quiet of the desert gave way to noise and color. Timbuktu, for example, was not yet the city of myth it would later become. But even in the 11th century, it was a crossroads of worlds. Traders from North Africa brought salt, copper, and textiles. Merchants from the south brought gold, ivory, and kola nuts. The air was thick with the scent of spices and the dust of travel. Arabic mixed with Songhai, Berber with Mandé. The markets stretched across open squares, shaded by woven mats. Salt slabs stood stacked in neat rows, gleaming white against the red dust. Buyers tested them by licking the edges. Pure salt should taste clean and sharp, not bitter. Every exchange was weighed, measured, and recorded, sometimes with written contracts in Arabic, other times with handshakes and oaths spoken in the desert tongue. Gold dust was measured with delicate brass spoons, salt by weight and sight. The rhythm of commerce was its own form of faith. The salt trade connected worlds that otherwise might never have touched. From the Mediterranean, caravans brought glass, books, and fine cloth. From West Africa, they returned with gold and slaves. Between them stretched a network of knowledge, scholars, travelers, and chroniclers moving with the merchants. One such traveler was Ibn Battuta, who crossed these routes in the 14th century, writing of the desert's vastness and the discipline of its people. But even before him, other geographers, like al-Bakri and al-Idrasi, described the trade in remarkable detail. They marveled at the organization of the caravans, at the cities that rose from sand, and at the way entire economies depended on the movement of salt. They called it the river that flows without water. In the kingdom of Ghana, where the desert routes met the savannah, the rulers grew rich from the trade. They taxed each camel that entered and left their cities, collecting a portion of the salt and gold alike. The royal court was said to be surrounded by dogs with golden collars and guarded by warriors dressed in silk. But beneath the wealth lay a simple truth. The king's power flowed from the caravans that crossed the desert. Without salt, the people could not live. Without trade, the kingdom could not stand. At night, in the campfires between dunes, the traders told stories of oases that vanished, of wells that sang, of lost caravans swallowed by sand. Some swore that the desert itself had moods, that it could remember kindness and revenge cruelty. It was not superstition exactly, more a form of respect. For those who crossed the Sahara, survival depended on humility. When a camel fell, its load was buried beside it, a quiet offering to the earth that had taken it. When men died, the sand covered them quickly, marking their graves only with a circle of stones. The desert kept its secrets. The caravans did not move quickly. A journey from Tagaza to Timbuktu might take 6 weeks. From Timbuktu to the gold fields near the Niger River, another month. Every step required calculation: water for men, fodder for beasts, patience for all. Progress was measured not in miles but in endurance. The rhythm of the bells, the creak of the harnesses, the crunch of sand underfoot, all became a kind of music. It was, in its way, the sound of civilization. Salt was not merely traded, it was revered. In many Saharan communities, salt was used in rituals, to seal agreements, to bless journeys, to protect against evil spirits. Children were given grains of salt at birth. Warriors carried it into battle. It symbolized purity, preservation, and endurance. Even in language, it endured. To eat salt together meant friendship. To break salt was betrayal. So when the traders led their camels through the dunes, they were not just moving goods. They were maintaining a covenant between earth and life, between the barren and the fertile. The desert took, but it also gave. By the 12th century, the salt trade had shaped entire civilizations. Cities like Gao Walata and Timbuktu became centers not only of commerce but of culture. The wealth of salt funded libraries, mosques, and universities. Scholars copied books on astronomy and medicine while traders counted their profits in blocks of white stone. The most ordinary of materials, something that dissolved in water, had built empires. And yet, even as the caravans grew larger, the desert remained indifferent. The dunes shifted, the wells dried, the storms came. No empire could conquer the Sahara. They could only move across it, one step at a time. One evening, as the sun sinks behind the dunes, the last light turns the salt slabs pink. The camels kneel, exhausted, while men wrap their faces against the wind. The bells fall silent. A traveler, resting beside the fire, looks out over the horizon. He wonders how many have crossed this sea of sand before him, and how many will follow after. The stars begin to appear, one by one, marking the invisible road ahead. The caravan will move again tomorrow, always forward, always into the silence. The desert remembers every footprint, though it erases them too. And the question remains, what happens when the salt runs out, or when the sands shift enough to hide the wells forever? Would the world beyond still remember the trade that once tied continents together? Or would it, like the wind, simply move on? By the 13th century, the salt roads had become the lifelines of an empire. At their northern edges, they connected to the ports of the Mediterranean, where ships carried spices, cloth, and metal from distant lands. To the south, they ended where the Niger River bent through fields of millet and gold. Between them stretched the great empires of Mali and Songhai. kingdoms that shone like mirages amid the dust. Their strength was not in armies alone, but in something quieter, the steady, unbroken rhythm of trade. The wealth of these kingdoms came from balance, the meeting of opposites. Salt from the desert, gold from the forest. The north and the south, the dry and the green, the barren